My ex used me to raise her kids, then left me for a richer man, but I took back everything and left her begging for mercy. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I thought I had found the woman I'd spend my life with, Elena. I still remember the first time we met, right after I graduated college, standing awkwardly at that coffee shop while she juggled two little kids, their tiny hands wrapped around hers. She smiled at me in that practiced, vulnerable way that made it feel like the universe had nudged me in the right direction. I just need someone stable, she told me over our first lunch, her voice soft but steady, someone who can help me build a life, not just for me, but for them too. I didn't hesitate. I wanted to be that person. I wanted to be the hero of their story, the solid ground beneath their small, fragile world. It didn't take long for me to sink completely into this role. I was paying bills I never thought I'd touch, covering school fees, extracurricular activities, even weekend outings the kids begged for. I'd wake up early to get them ready for school, pack lunches, make sure homework was done, and somehow still make it to my own job on time. Elena would lean on the counter, watching me with that faint, appreciative smile. "You're amazing," she'd whisper, brushing a strand of hair from my face. And for a while, I believed it. I felt proud, like I'd finally found my purpose outside of work and friends, outside of my own little bubble of adulthood. Friends and family noticed too. "You're really stepping up," they'd say, clinking their beers with mine, admiring the devotion I barely acknowledged in myself. I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing, that I was making a difference, not realizing I was handing over the keys to my life piece by piece. And yet, there were moments, tiny little edges of doubt, that I brushed off. A flicker of annoyance when she complained about money she wasn't paying, a sly look when I questioned where she spent what I'd provided. At the time, I laughed it off. I told myself love required sacrifice, that these were minor cracks, nothing more. But deep down, though I didn't let myself dwell on it, the foundation beneath us was already starting to shift. And I had no idea just how quickly it would crumble. Living with Elena and her kids quickly became my full-time life, more intense than I ever imagined. Mornings started before sunrise, packing lunches, making sure everyone was dressed, breakfast on the table, and somehow squeezing in my own commute to work. Weekends weren't for rest, they were filled with soccer games, dance recitals, and trips to the park, always making sure the kids felt loved and secure. And through it all, Elena would hover nearby, occasionally praising me, but more often sighing and muttering about all the responsibility. She had this way of making it feel like my sacrifices were expected, normal, just part of the deal, while she remained untouched by the stress of it all. I tried not to notice the little things, the way she sometimes whispered to friends about how hard I was to live with, or the subtle eye rolls when I suggested something for the kids. Her friends adored her and seemed to treat me like a guest in my own life, quietly undermining my confidence. Once, I caught her laughing at something on the phone with a friend, brushing it off when I asked. "It's nothing, babe, just work stuff," she said, her smile so convincing I almost believed it. And I did. I clung to the idea that I was part of something bigger, that my hard work and dedication were building a real family. But every now and then, the cracks peeked through. A late-night text hidden away from me, a suspicious withdrawal from our joint account, or a sharp comment meant to make me feel guilty. I tried to rationalize it all. "She's stressed," I told myself. "She's doing the best she can. I just need to be patient." And so I kept giving, kept sacrificing, convinced that love required endless endurance. Still, deep down, something didn't feel right. A small, gnawing sense in the pit of my stomach whispered that I was being pulled into a life that wasn't truly mine, one where I was constantly giving, while she remained untouchable. But I pushed it aside, unaware that the tension hiding beneath the surface was about to erupt. It started with small things at first, little cracks I didn't know how to interpret. Elena would brush off my questions with a tired sigh, like I was imagining things. "Mark's just a friend from work," she said one evening when I asked about a name I'd seen pop up in her messages. I nodded, trying to convince myself I wasn't jealous, that I was being supportive and reasonable. But something about the way she avoided eye contact, the way her voice tightened when she said his name, gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being kept at arm's length from something I had a right to know. At the same time, my financial sacrifices were piling up. Covering groceries, kids' tuition, doctor appointments, everything added up, and yet Elena seemed to have this endless stream of extra expenses I hadn't been told about. Once, I noticed a withdrawal for a fancy dinner, with a friend of hers, that she didn't bother mentioning. When I asked, she laughed lightly. It was just business, she said, rolling her eyes, but there was an edge to it that stung. My stomach twisted. I wanted to confront her, but I convinced myself patience and trust were more important. Even the kid seemed to sense it. One night, my stepson asked quietly, "Why doesn't mommy ever say thank you for everything you do?" I froze. I didn't know what to say without shattering the fragile family illusion I'd built around us. I felt trapped between wanting to protect them and fearing what I might uncover if I dug too deep. It hit me slowly, the way a storm creeps over the horizon. I started noticing patterns I couldn't ignore. Receipts for things I didn't know about, expensive dinners she claimed were work meetings, nights she said she was exhausted but wasn't home. I remember one evening, walking past her laptop on the kitchen counter, seeing an email from Mark with flirtatious undertones. My chest tightened, but when I confronted her, she smiled that calm, practiced smile of hers. "You're imagining things," she said softly, tilting her head. "I'm tired, stressed, don't make a mountain out of a molehill." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. I told myself she was overworked, maybe even lonely, and that the signs I saw were innocent. But each small lie piled on the next, like a slow leak in a dam, and my confidence began to crumble. I started questioning everything, the late-night calls, the way her demeanor would shift when I walked into a room, the fleeting glances at her phone I wasn't meant to see. My trust, which I had handed over so freely, began to feel like it had been stolen piece by piece. Even the kids were affected. They seemed more anxious, quieter at dinner, sometimes asking me questions that made my heart ache. "Why is mommy always on her phone?" one of them whispered one evening. I didn't know how to answer. I felt trapped in a life that looked perfect on the outside but was quietly unraveling around me. And yet, I clung to hope, convincing myself I could fix it, that love could survive manipulation. But the truth I'd been avoiding was just around the corner, and I could already feel the walls closing in. I had no idea how devastating the reality would be, or how quickly my world was about to collapse. I'll never forget the moment the truth hit me, like a punch to the chest. One evening, I came home early from work, planning to surprise Elena and the kids with dinner. Instead, I found her laughing on the couch with Mark, their faces so close it made my stomach churn. My hand froze on the doorknob as I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that it couldn't be real. But the whispers of familiarity in their conversation, the way she rested her hand on his knee, left no doubt. She'd been seeing him for months, right under my nose. I remember the kids running into the living room, oblivious to the tension, and my heart broke all over again. "Daddy, are we having spaghetti tonight?" my stepson asked. I forced a smile, but inside I felt hollow, like every ounce of trust I'd built had been ripped away. I confronted Elena immediately, my voice shaking. "How long?" I asked, trying to keep it calm. She didn't even flinch. "Long enough," she said, almost proudly, before standing and brushing past me to kiss Mark's cheek. I felt numb, like I was watching someone else's life unravel in slow motion. Everything I had done, the money, the time, the love I poured into her children, into her, was a tool she had wielded against me. I wanted to scream, to break something, anything, but I couldn't. The kids were looking at me, eyes wide, and I realized that this was bigger than anger, it was betrayal on a scale I wasn't prepared for. The world I thought I was building, the family I thought I was becoming part of, had been a carefully constructed illusion. And in that moment, I understood something gut-wrenching. I had been used, manipulated, and discarded before the battle had even begun. And I had no idea just how much I was about to lose. Elena left that night. She packed her bags, her children, and some of the money I had saved for us quietly over the months. I stood in the doorway, numb, watching the life I thought I was building vanish piece by piece. The kids ran past me without a word, too young to understand the storm they were caught in, and I couldn't even look at Elena without feeling a mix of fury and disbelief. My heart ached in ways I didn't know were possible, every memory I'd held on to now twisted by betrayal. I tried to sleep that night, but it was impossible. The apartment, once warm and full of life, felt like a hollow shell. Every photograph, every toy scattered across the living room, was a reminder of what I had sacrificed and how easily it had been thrown away. Friends called, texts poured in, "Are you okay?" they asked, but I couldn't even begin to explain the depth of the devastation. I had nothing left to give, and worse, no idea how to rebuild trust in anything, let alone another person. Even my work, once my refuge, felt meaningless. I stared at my computer screen, the numbers and emails blurred, thinking about how every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar I'd poured into their lives had been used as a tool to manipulate me. The shame was almost unbearable. I felt like a fool for believing in her, for believing in us. I couldn't eat, I couldn't focus, I couldn't stop replaying the scenes over and over. And yet, amid the heartbreak, a tiny spark of something else began to flicker inside me, a quiet, burning realization that this wasn't the end. I had been taken for granted, yes, but I wasn't broken. And if I was going to survive this, I would need to reclaim everything she had stolen from me, piece by piece. But first, I had to face the abyss she had thrown me into, fully and completely. After hitting rock bottom, I realized wallowing wasn't going to change anything. I couldn't undo the betrayal, but I could control what happened next. So I started documenting everything, bank statements, receipts, texts, emails, anything that proved how Elena had manipulated me financially and emotionally. Every transaction I'd made for her and the kids, every favor I'd done, suddenly became evidence, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control. I consulted a lawyer discreetly, making sure each step was strategic. "You're taking this seriously?" he asked. I nodded, explaining everything, how she drained my savings, exploited my time and emotions, and left me without a word of warning. I wasn't just going to let her walk away unscathed, I wanted justice, and more importantly, I wanted to reclaim my life. I started rebuilding my routine slowly, focusing on my career, my health, and my own space. Gym mornings, quiet evenings with friends, even hobbies I had abandoned, I reclaimed them all. Each small victory reinforced that I was no longer a passive participant in my own story. Elena had underestimated me, and the realization sparked something I hadn't felt in a long time: power. At night, when the apartment was quiet and the world felt still, I'd sit with the files I'd collected, imagining how the confrontation would go. The thought of finally standing my ground, calmly exposing everything she had done, made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with anticipation. I was no longer the man she could manipulate with a smile or a sob. And as I closed the binder for the night, I couldn't help but feel it: the first step of turning the tables had been taken. She had no idea what was coming next. Elena was smug. I could feel it through the grapevine. Friends, mutual acquaintances, even her texts made it clear she thought I'd crumbled, disappeared quietly, like I had no fight left. She bragged about how easy it had been to walk away, how she had upgraded her life without consequence. But she didn't know the quiet storm I was building behind the scenes. I discovered the leverage I never thought I'd have. She had overextended financially, taking on debts she assumed I would cover or ignore. The very things she used to manipulate me, our shared expenses, the kids' extracurriculars, the bills she'd relied on me to pay, now became my weapons. I filed legal claims, prepared evidence, and secured every document showing her exploitation. Suddenly, the power dynamics had flipped. The night I sent the first formal notices, I remember sitting back in my chair, staring at the screen, a strange calm settling over me. Mark, her new partner, had no idea what was coming. Elena's carefully constructed confidence was crumbling without her even realizing it. Even the kids were starting to notice subtle changes. Elena's tone shifted when she spoke to me, her eyes flickering with something between panic and frustration. I couldn't help but feel a cold satisfaction. For months I had been the passive, exploited partner, the fool who loved too hard. And now, for the first time, I knew the tables had turned. Elena had made a fatal miscalculation, and I was ready to see just how far it would unravel her carefully curated life. But she had no idea just how quickly it would hit. I moved carefully, deliberately. Every legal claim I filed, every document I presented, was a piece of the puzzle I'd been quietly building. Bills she assumed I would cover. Reclaimed. Savings she thought she could drain. Frozen and redirected back to me. Shared property, household assets, and even financial support she expected as a gift, I was taking it all back, step by calculated step. Elena's smug confidence shattered faster than I anticipated. Mark, her better man, was blindsided by the legal notices and the detailed evidence I provided. For the first time, they weren't in control. I watched from a distance as the reality of their recklessness began sinking in. Elena called, texted, even tried to negotiate, her voice shaking when she said, "Please, let's just settle quietly. You don't need to do this." I stayed calm, letting the weight of the evidence and the law speak for me. The kids were safe, and that was my only priority. Seeing Elena panic and scramble, realizing that I had authority and leverage she never imagined I would muster, gave me a sense of vindication I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't acting out of spite, I was reclaiming everything she thought she could take from me. Friends started noticing the change too, the quiet confidence I carried that had been missing since the betrayal. They began checking in, asking how I was handling everything, not realizing the satisfaction I was quietly savoring. Every call, every email, every carefully documented step was a reminder, I was no longer the passive victim. And as I sat back that night, reviewing the progress, I realized one thing crystal clear: Elena had underestimated me, and she would soon pay the price for it. The confrontation was coming, and she had no idea how devastating it would be. It was time. I arranged a meeting under the guise of trying to resolve things amicably, though in reality, I was ready to expose everything. Elena arrived, radiant as ever, with that same smug look I had come to despise. Mark trailed behind her, confident and unaware, convinced I had no cards left to play. I waited until they were seated before I began. "Do you remember every dollar I contributed?" I asked, calm but steady. Elena's eyes flickered nervously. I laid out the evidence: bills she had assumed I'd cover, expenses she'd claimed were hers, receipts, messages, and every transaction that proved manipulation. Mark's face turned pale as he scanned the documents. Elena stammered, trying to interrupt, but I didn't falter. "Everything you thought you could take for granted has been accounted for," I said, letting the words hang in the air. The air between us thickened, the kids' names tucked in my mind as my guiding principle. I wasn't here to scream or plead, I was here to show her the consequences of her choices. Every smug smile she had relied on crumbled in silence. I could see the realization in Mark's eyes: he had no idea what he had stepped into. For the first time in months, I felt in complete control. Elena's attempts at persuasion, at guilt-tripping me, fell flat. I remained poised, measured, letting the weight of the law and the evidence speak louder than anger ever could. And as they left the room, their world quietly unraveling, I realized something profound: I wasn't just reclaiming money or stability. I was reclaiming myself. But the final chapter, the one where everything truly falls into place, was yet to come. After the confrontation, something shifted in me that I hadn't felt in years: freedom. The legal claims were settled in my favor, the money I had poured into Elena's life was returned, and the household assets I helped maintain were finally under my control. I rebuilt quietly, step by step, focusing on myself, my work, and the little joys I had neglected while being manipulated. Gym mornings, coffee with friends, reading at night without guilt, these became small acts of liberation that reminded me who I truly was. Elena tried, of course, to insert herself back into my life, pleading for settlements or leniency, but I stayed calm. I let the law speak for me, and silence became my most powerful weapon. Mark, too, began distancing himself, realizing that Elena's reckless choices had consequences he hadn't anticipated. The children were safe, and while I still loved them, I no longer carried the weight of Elena's manipulations on my shoulders. Friends noticed the change too, the quiet confidence, the way I moved through life without hesitation or fear. Some asked how I managed to stay so composed, but I knew it wasn't about composure, it was about reclaiming power that had been stolen. I wasn't seeking revenge in the dramatic sense, my victory was measured in stability, dignity, and boundaries. For the first time, I realized I could live without constantly fearing betrayal, without waking up every day wondering if someone I trusted would discard me. The woman who had once seemed untouchable was now powerless, her influence over me completely gone. And in that calm, controlled moment, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace. But the story wasn't quite over, the final blow, the ultimate closure, was still coming. Months later, I heard through mutual contacts that Elena's life was unraveling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Mark had distanced himself completely, frustrated by the financial chaos and her recklessness. Friends who once envied her now avoided her, and the small world she had built for herself was collapsing quietly but relentlessly. Meanwhile, I had moved forward, new routines, new investments, a life no longer defined by manipulation or betrayal. I bought a modest apartment, filled it with things that reminded me of independence rather than sacrifice, and finally felt at home in my own skin. She reached out sporadically, pleading, apologizing, begging for forgiveness, but I stayed silent. Not because I was cruel, but because silence carried more weight than any words I could have said. Walking away without confrontation, letting the law and consequences handle the rest, was the ultimate form of justice. I watched from a distance as the repercussions of her choices slowly unfolded, and for the first time, I felt complete closure. The kids, now in a stable environment, were thriving. I maintained healthy boundaries with them, keeping them safe from the chaos Elena had created. I realized that my strength didn't come from winning a fight or shouting in anger, it came from surviving, strategizing, and reclaiming my life on my terms. And as I sat quietly in my new apartment one evening, sipping a cup of coffee and listening to the city hum outside my window, I felt it, peace, empowerment, and satisfaction. The woman who had once used me, betrayed me, and discarded me had nothing left to manipulate, nothing left to take. In the end, I didn't need revenge to be loud or public. My quiet, patient reclaiming of my life had been far more devastating, and far more satisfying, than anything she could have imagined. And for the first time in years, I could finally breathe.